Hey, 42 here. There have been many prolific geniuses throughout history. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, Charles Dickens, Vincent van Gogh. But legendary film director Alan Smithee differs from these people in three important ways. Firstly, he wasn't a genius. Secondly, most of his work could be described as utter shit. And thirdly, he doesn't actually exist. Mind you, Alan never let his non-existence hold him back. And when you consider he directed such outstanding films as Ghost Fever, The Shrimp on the Barbie, Blood-Sucking Pharaohs from Pittsburgh, and Le Zombie de Cap Rouge, it's hard to believe he isn't a household name. But where did this mysterious purveyor of mediocre movies come from? Alan Smithee was born in 1969, but through necessity rather than the birth canal, and with the Directors Guild of America acting as midwife. You see, Alan Smithee is simply a fake name, a pseudonym used by members of the DGA when they were so unhappy with a movie they'd rather burn the negative, themselves and all of their possessions, before seeing their real name attached to it. But you couldn't just Smithee your name out of a film willy-nilly. Oh no. First, you had to convince a DGA panel you'd lost creative control of the project. And even if you did get a yes, you weren't ever allowed to discuss the film afterwards. In other words, the first rule of Smithee Club was that you did not talk about Smithee Club. People had used pseudonyms in the film industry before, of course. In 1947, screenwriter Dalton Trumbo was blacklisted in Hollywood on suspicion of being a communist. So he adopted various false names, including Robert Rich and Felix Lutskendorf, to get his work out into the world. And in 1964, Sergio Leone made the legendary spaghetti western A Fistful of Dollars under the name Bob Robertson, thinking it would be more palatable to American audiences. But it was with the 1969 film Death of a Gunfighter that the most famous of all Hollywood pseudonyms first came into being. Until this point, pseudonyms were against the DGA rules, so as to stop producers from forcing little-known or unpopular directors to adopt them. The DGA were also great believers in auteur theory, which suggests that whilst a huge number of people come together to create a film, the director is the driving creative force behind it, and should therefore be given full credit for his work. With Death of a Gunfighter, however, things got a little complicated. Lead actor Richard Widmark went full diva and got the original director Robert Totten fired. But when filming wrapped, new director Don Siegel told a DGA panel he didn't feel it was right for him to be credited as the director, as the film was mostly Totten's work. But Totten himself was understandably upset at having been unceremoniously canned from the project, and he didn't want his name attached to it either. The DGA ultimately agreed neither director's creative vision had been represented in the final cut, but that left them with a problem. Who were they going to credit as the director? Now, some have suggested the name Alan Smithee, with its two E's, was chosen because it's an anagram of the Alias Men. But this is basically an urban legend, and with no real evidence to back it up. The truth, sadly, is somewhat duller. Al Smith was the original suggestion, but someone pointed out that picking such a common name probably wasn't a great idea, which turned out to be true, because several Al Smiths were already working in the film industry at the time. So the Al was changed to Alan, the Smith became Smithee, and a non-existent Hollywood legend was born. Weirdly enough, Smithee's first outing as director was critically acclaimed, which must have been more than slightly annoying for Death of a Gunfighter's two anonymous directors. He was specifically singled out for praise, with the New York Times writing that Alan Smithee had an adroit facility for scanning faces and extracting sharp background detail. And Roger Ebert, for a long time the preeminent film critic in the US, saying he admired the way Smithy allowed his story to unfold naturally. But over the years, this would very much be the exception that proved the rule. Watching an Alan Smithy film is usually the cinematic equivalent of getting the tip of your penis caught in a car door. In other words, extremely painful. After all, who else but Alan Smithy would attempt a sequel to the Alfred Hitchcock classic, The Birds? I mean, for Hitchcock fans, that's akin to catapulting your own excrement at the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. Even actress Tippi Hedren, who appeared in both films, described The Birds 2: Land's End as absolutely horrible, and went on to say that it still embarrassed her decades later. An IMDb rating of 2.9 suggests that embarrassment was entirely warranted too. In some cases, directors have smithied their movies many years after the original release, due to them being well and truly mangled for television. When it came to the TV version of David Lynch's Dune, for example, he not only insisted on an Alan Smithy directing credit, but also changed his screenwriting credit to Judas Booth, a combination of Judas Iscariot and John Wilkes Booth. If your screenwriting pseudonym is a mixture of the man who betrayed Christ and the man who shot Abraham Lincoln, it's probably fair to say you're not a big fan of the script. Director Michael Mann has had to give his credits a good smithying on more than one occasion, not least when NBC wanted to recut his 3-hour epic Heat back in 1999. Mann told Variety that so much was cut out of the movie, it completely destroyed the narrative, and he went on to describe the edit as piss-poor management of an asset they paid a lot of money for. Another serial credit murderer is Martin Brest, who felt the same way about the in-flight versions of his films Meet Joe Black and Scent of a Woman, as the rest of us feel about in-flight meals. Needless to say, he wasted no time in smithying the living daylights out of them. Not all attempts by directors to smithy themselves out of their films have been successful, however. Director Tony Kaye did his best to disown American History X after cast members made changes to the script and the studio rejected his incredibly bleak finale. Kaye left in a huff and then tried to Allen his way out of a credit, which was rejected by the DGA. So he tried again with another alias, Humpty Dumpty. Surprisingly, that didn't work either. So he sued the DGA for $200 million and alienated himself from everyone in Hollywood in the process. He's also reported to have engaged in some pretty bizarre behavior during this time, like turning up to a meeting with the film studio accompanied by a rabbi, a Tibetan monk, and a priest, which sounds like the start of an inappropriate joke your uncle tells you when he's had too much to drink. But apparently Kaye was deadly serious, feeling he needed the help of God to get his point across. I suppose that's Hollywood for you. You never have that kind of trouble running a YouTube channel. Possibly one of the most ironic uses of Hollywood's favourite pseudonym was in 1997's An Alan Smithy film, Burn Hollywood Burn, a mockumentary with Eric Idle playing a director named Alan Smithy, who tries to disown his big-budget action film starring Sylvester Stallone, Whoopi Goldberg, and Jackie Chan. Needless to say, he can't Alan Smithy himself out of the credits because that's already his name. So he's forced to steal the film and go on the run. Which all sounds confusing enough as it is before you factor in what happened after production. You see, director Arthur Hiller, like many directors before him, complained to the DGA that he'd been kept out of the editing process and should therefore be able to abstain from a credit on the film. All of which means that a film about Alan Smithy, called An Alan Smithy Film, Burn Hollywood Burn, ended up being directed by Alan Smithy himself. You just couldn't make it up, which is pretty much how Hiller felt. To add insult to injury, the film was a massive failure, which probably shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, considering the entire plot was based on an obscure piece of Hollywood culture the vast majority of the population has never even heard of. It grossed just under $60,000 worldwide, despite having an estimated budget of $10 million, and was absolutely crucified by the critics. With a weird sense of coming full circle, Roger Ebert, who'd written such a positive review of Death of a Gunfighter back in 1969, the film which gave birth to Alan Smithee, gave this one a score of 0 stars. It has a Rotten Tomatoes rating of 8% positive, and their critical consensus calls it a witless Hollywood satire whose hammy, obvious jokes are neither funny nor insightful of the movie business. Pretty damning, but then I suppose it's their job to be critical. When your lead actor's saying a similar thing, however, then it's probably not a great sign. Even when he was busy promoting the film, Eric Idle regularly came out with the phrase, "This is rather dreadful." If it was possible for actors to Smithee themselves out of a film, you can bet Idle would have done so, even if he was portraying a character called Alan Smithee. Burn Hollywood Burn went on to win 4 Razzies, or Golden Raspberry Awards, for Worst Picture, Worst Screenplay, Worst New Star, and Worst Supporting Actor. All of which went to Joe Estejarez, who both starred in and produced the film. Sylvester Stallone was also nominated in the Worst Supporting Actor category that year, which is particularly ironic when you consider he was playing himself. You know your acting career's in trouble when you can't even portray yourself convincingly. Estejarez also won the Stinker Award for Worst On-Screen Hairstyle, and the film was nominated for another stinker in the category of Most Painfully Unfunny Comedy. So yeah, it's fair to say it wasn't a great piece of work, but perhaps its most damning legacy of all was that even Alan Smithee couldn't get work afterwards. The negativity surrounding the film had brought so much attention to the pseudonym, it could no longer be used at all. Filmmakers have used a variety of other pseudonyms over the years, but for comedy value, none are quite as good as screenwriter Robert Towns, after his passion project 1984's Greystroke: The Legend of Tarzan, Lord of the Apes, was destroyed by studio interference. He removed his writing credit and replaced it with P.H. Vazak, which might sound exotic, but was actually the name of his pet sheepdog. This not only highlighted the fact that more dogs should have surnames, but also resulted in an Academy Award nomination for the screenplay, making P.H. Vazak the world's first and only canine to be considered for an Oscar. Good boy. Animal pseudonyms seem to be popular within the screenwriting community, because fantasy writer Harlan Ellison occasionally used the name Cordwainer Bird when his work was mangled by producers. Fellow writer Stephen King thought this was Ellison's subtle way of flipping studio execs the bird. Here in the UK, we briefly had our own version of Alan Smithee, David Agnew, a name that was invented to overcome a very British problem: bureaucracy. This pseudonym was used in the BBC during the 70s if freelance writers were unable to incorporate changes requested by a show's producer at the very last minute. When that happened, members of the production staff, who weren't allowed to take screen credits without a long, drawn-out appeals process, would be asked to perform a rewrite under Agnew's name. One notable example is the 1979 Doctor Who episode City of Death, not least because it was co-written by Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy author Douglas Adams. If you aren't familiar with Adams' work, I encourage you to go and check it out. That guy really does know a thing or two about life, the universe, and everything. Anyway, David Agnew has since become a familiar name in Doctor Who fandom, occasionally popping up in other episodes and books, not to mention the mockumentary The Elusive David Agnew, which, by the way, was directed by some guy called Alan Smithee. Back on the other side of the Atlantic, Alan has also enjoyed a thriving career outside of motion pictures. He directed 2 episodes of MacGyver, a few segments of Tiny Toon Adventures, and a couple of episodes of The Cosby Show. Although, to be fair, it isn't only disgruntled directors who want to distance themselves from Bill Cosby these days. Smithee's also written several comics for DC and Marvel, and has even dipped his toe into the world of gaming. The 1993 Nintendo game, Equinox, credits Alan Smithee as director. Marine Sharpshooter 4 has him as art director, and in a weird twist, Arran showed up as the director of Metal Gear Solid 4 in a teaser trailer, before being replaced by Hideo Kojima at launch. Is it possible that Arran Smithy requested his name to be removed from the project? Maybe he didn't want such a critically acclaimed game ruining his hard-fought reputation as one of the worst directors ever to have lived. Or ever to have not lived, in this case. Like many famous directors before him, Arran's also worked on quite a few music videos in his time. There was Whitney Houston's I Will Always Love You, Kiss the Rain by Billy Myers, Waiting for Tonight by Jennifer Lopez, Maria by Blondie, and Lose My Breath by Destiny's Child. But despite his glittering career in music promos, there doesn't seem to be an official Arran Smithy for the musicians themselves, which is a shame because some of them seem pretty keen to disown their most famous works. For example, Radiohead have long since grown tired of their signature song, Creep, going so far as to pull it from their live set for 7 years. Led Zeppelin's Robert Plant once pledged $10,000 to a radio station if they agreed to never play Stairway to Heaven again. And in 2008, Madonna publicly stated she wouldn't sing Like a Virgin or Holiday ever again unless somebody paid her $30 million. Mind you, she was singing them 8 years later on her 2016 tour, so I guess someone put up the cash. So much for artistic integrity, eh, Madge? After some 30 years at the top, or bottom, Arran Smithy's career was officially over by the year 2000, following director Walter Hill's attempt to get his film Supernova off the ground. Hill's budget was not only cut by the studio halfway through production, but they also decided to preview the movie before any of the special effects had been added. Not a great choice for a sci-fi film. Anyway, Hill soon left the project, but due to the backlash from Burn Hollywood Burn, his name wasn't replaced by Arran Smithy, but by Thomas Lee, a new name the DGA were trying out. The great Arran Smithy was officially dead. But despite the significant handicap of being deceased, Arran still pops up every now and then, albeit with various creative tweaks. The duo of Arran and Alana Smithee wrote the screenplay for the film Hidden 3D, and in 2010, a Dutch female version of Arran, Ellen Smith, most likely to meet their imaginary employees' diversity quota, directed the film Eep. And then, in 2018, defying all medical explanations, the late Arran Smithy himself directed the horror movie The Night Watchers, along with several episodes of the French TV series Tomorrow Is Ours. For a dead guy, he's been surprisingly busy. But hey, Arran's never let a little thing like not existing get in the way of his work. And I think it's about time Hollywood gave him some recognition. After all, who else can you think of with such an extensive IMDb listing? Let me leave you with this thought. Screenwriter Charlie Kaufman was nominated for an Oscar for the 2002 film Adaptation, along with his late twin brother Donald. The weird thing, however, was that Donald hadn't died. In fact, he'd never lived. Kaufman just invented him to add depth to his multi-dimensional plot and decided to give him a screenwriting credit. So, if Charlie's non-existent Donald can be nominated for an Oscar, then why can't our non-existent Arran? He doesn't have to win, of course, and he probably won't, because he's directed some of the worst films in history. But hey, it's the thought that counts. Thanks for watching. You can now buy my new book, Stick a Flag in It, on Amazon, or get the audiobook on Audible. You'll find a link to both in the description below. Thank you.